amazing presentation and for all the information. And let me please welcome here another speakers. It's Dr. Kreider from Texas A&M University and his colleague Dr. Jeffrey State from University of Central Florida. Floor is yours.
Howdy, I'm Rick Kreider from Texas A&M University, and again, I'd like to welcome you to our Creatine 22 conference. Today, I'm going to give you an overview about creatine health disease and provide a roadmap for this conference and some of the presentations you're going to see. As we just heard, creatine is the most popular nutritional ergogenic aid for athletes. And there's many studies showing that there's an effect of creatine on intramuscular creatine stores, and this can improve exercise performance, training adaptations over time, and have application not only for athletes, but people who are fitness-minded. It also has been shown to affect recovery and injury prevention, even help manage thermoregulation during exercise, enhance recovery from physical rehabilitation, and there's even some data in animals suggesting it might protect against concussion or traumatic brain injury or spinal cord injury. And so there's a number of clinical applications for creatine that initially, as we started doing research, we've started looking at some of these clinical applications. And if you look at what happens in the body when you take creatine, in red or blue is a person on a normal diet. This includes meat and fish that is the primary source of dietary creatine. If you're a vegan or a little bit older and don't absorb as much creatine in diet, your levels are a little lower. And then if you take creatine, you load with creatine, as we'll talk about, you can typically get a 10 to 15, 20% increase in creatine stores. Most studies show about 30 to 40% increase. And if you take it with carbohydrate and protein, everybody responds well in that 20 to 30% response. So we know that if you add creatine to the diet, for example, through dietary supplementation, it can improve performance. And in 2007, and then later in 2017, the International Society of Sport Nutrition published our first position stand, and it was on creatine supplementation, which we've updated. And the two take-home points here is that creatine monohydrate is the most effective ergogenic nutritional supplement available to improve high-intensity exercise capacity and lean body mass during training. And we also indicated that you might see some therapeutic benefits. And a section of this paper in 2017 describes some of the health benefits that are starting to be reported from creatine supplementation in populations that may benefit from increasing creatine stores in the muscle and or brain or other tissues. And we had a section on that. And so over the last few years, we've talked about doing an update about the medical applications of creatine and potential uses in clinical populations. And Dr. Jeff Stout and I were asked to do a special issue on creatine for health and clinical disease for the journal Nutrients. And so last year, we published the first paper of 28 that were published over the last year on creatine in health and disease. And this first paper served as an overview of the various aspects in which creatine had been studied. Certainly some areas need more study, but at least these are areas that are being looked at as potential therapeutic applications of creatine supplementation. And if you look through this paper, you'll see that we touched on a number of areas from infants in third trimester and moms during pregnancy, all the way through elderly individuals that may benefit from creatine, as well as some specific diseases that might be enhanced or help managed therapeutically by adjunctive therapy with creatine supplementation. And so this overview served as now a book that just came out that you can download free. If you go onto the website, you can download this free, or you can purchase a hardcover version of this. And this brings us here today. And we thought, what a great way to present this information for the general public as well as the medical community who may not know as much about creatine supplementation as many of the researchers do, how best to be able to portray this out into the community through online vehicle as our conference today. And so as we go into this, I'm going to ask Dr. Jeff Stout to join us for a second. And as much research has been done on creatine, if you look back at the history, it may never have happened without the story of Roger Harris and Sammy the horse. So Dr. Stout, can you join us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, everyone from Orlando, Florida. Welcome to the conference. About a year ago, I reached out to Professor Harris and asked him if he could share with me the early days of creatine research. And what he told me was pretty amazing that I don't know if anybody knows. Um, and so, go ahead and click forward. So, as you guys know, or you may not know, Professor Harris was one of the first postdocs in the famous Bergstrom-Hultman Muscle Metabolism Laboratory, in which they developed the muscle biopsy technique to look at glycogen, and then also started investigating ATP, ADP, all those things that were mentioned earlier that are in textbooks. Well, one of the things they were interested in was the possibility of increasing creatine in the muscle. So Roger tells me that they did a study in 1975 where they attempted to raise the level of creatine or total creatine in skeletal muscle, looking pre and post muscle biopsy. And what was really interesting in that study, well, first of all, there are a few people in the lab that didn't believe that this would work. And so there's already a bias against this study. Um, then the results of the study showed that the two participants had initial levels greater than 150 millimolar per kilogram of dry muscle, which, as those of you who know the creatine research, that's up the upper limit of creatine storage. So needless to say that there was no significant increase with supplementation, and it was believed that that was because creatine could not be absorbed through the gut, the GI system. Well, that 1975 study was never published and actually stalled research on creatine for almost 2 decades. Roger then, when he left his postdoc, he actually went to industry, and then for a while, then he came back in the late 80s, back to academia, only now he was looking at fatigue, metabolism, and racing camels, racing horses, and racing dogs. Well, once he received some creatine monohydrate, and that's a whole nother story. On an October morning, he decided he wanted to give some creatine monohydrate to see if it would work in a racing horse. And this racing horse is the actual picture of that horse is on the right. His name was Sammy. And what Roger tried to do was dilute 10 grams of creatine monohydrate in 50 milliliters of water in this big old syringe in order to squirt it in his mouth. But unfortunately, the solubility of 10 grams in 50 milliliters wasn't going to happen. So it kept jamming up. And the trainer was getting frustrated and because Roger was taking so much time. So he abandoned that. Roger was really frustrated. So what he ended up doing was just diluting 5 grams of creatine monohydrate in 300 milliliters of water, and he drank it himself. And then he looked for the closest veterinarian and who took his blood at 30 minutes and 60 minutes. And what happened was Roger discovered that, in fact, the GI system, creatine monohydrate does pass through the GI system into the blood, and he saw this nice increase. He was so excited. And the latest technology back then, by the way, was fax, when you fax somebody. So he faxed Dr. Hultman and convinced him, we need to do another study. That study ended up being the 1992 seminal study that started it all. The evaluation of creatine in resting and exercise muscle in normal subjects by creatine supplementation. And I created this graph, as you can see, all the creatine publications, really nothing was happening until 1992. Then you can see an exponential growth in creatine supplementation. And oh, by the way, if he would have been successful and given Sammy, the racehorse, creatine monohydrate, he would have seen nothing because in the GI system, very little creatine passes because they're herbivores. They don't have creatine transporters. And so he would have concluded that just like in humans, creatine does not pass through the gut, therefore it doesn't work. Thank goodness that study failed and he gave it to himself.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay, can you see me? Okay, great, thank you. So what I want to do is give you an overview of the article we published last January on the role of creatine in health and disease. And as typical, we talked a little bit about the effects of creatine on muscle and on exercise performance, but the crux of the article is what has been studied to date on the effects of creatine in health. And the first thing I'm going to point out is that much of the initial studies in diseased populations were really done in kids with creatine synthesis or creatine transporter deficiencies. These are kids that, if not identified young, with these deficiencies and given large doses of creatine monohydrate have a lot of developmental issues, both cognitively as well as in psychomotor type of performance. And so now they actually do screening in infants to see if they are deficient in creatine synthesis enzymes or transporters, and then try to give them creatine in some instances, especially the AGAT and the GMT deficiencies, seem to be very helpful in getting these kids back to normal maturation. So there was a number of studies in the 80s that gave between 0.3 to 0.8 grams per kg per day to these kids for years to try to increase the availability of creatine, particularly in the brain, and showed some benefit. So we talk about that initial research, and then we have a paper that will Diego Bonilla will present next, which talks about the metabolic basis of creatine in health. Instead of a lot of special issues just saying it's open call and send some articles in and have kind of a mishmash, we, in this case, tried to treat this like a structured book where we identified topics and we identified leading scholars to be able to write detailed reviews through the review process and then publish them in a sequential manner, which is the book that we're featuring at this conference. And what Diego will show is that creatine's not just involved in the ATP-PC energy system like we thought initially for explosive exercise. There's so many more metabolic roles of creatine for mitochondria, for neurotransmission, for lots of different things that really serve as the basis for enhancing health aspects of creatine. And so we'll hear more from Diego in a few minutes. We then have some data that Dr. Stacy Ellery will present from her paper. And there have been studies in infants and third trimester pregnancy in animals. And as you know, some kids are born and the umbilical cord will wrap around the neck and cause asphyxia. Well, we know that moms, as they go through the third trimester, have a greater need for creatine because the fetus is using more creatine for development. And we know that in animals, if they have animals fed with creatine and there's this asphyxia, that the chances of survival are improved by almost 50%. And so Dr. Ellery is going to be talking about the role of creatine in pregnancy and newborn health. Interesting. Dr. Andrew Jagum is going to then talk about creatine in children and adolescents and the role of creatine in the diet. And for example, there are studies now showing that kids that have less creatine in their diet don't grow as fast at height, stature, have less weight, and greater body fat. This is work coming out of Serge Ostajic's lab in Serbia. And so he's going to overview the role of creatine in children and adolescents. And the conclusion is there's lots of potential applications, and this might be a great way to help promote nutrition, as well as good training adaptations and good adaptations as kids grow, as well as reduce some injuries. The next paper we're going to talk about is the traditional exercise adaptations. And Dr. Ben Wax from Mississippi State University is going to go through in a detailed manner of what studies and what type of exercises may benefit from creatine. When we first started doing this research, we thought maybe just muscular endurance. And then we gave it to athletes during training and build muscle and build performance and endurance. But there's a lot of athletic events and exercise events where creatine can be beneficial. And Dr. Wax with Dr. Kurtzik and a few others of us did a very nice review in breaking down the data for what type of events might benefit from creatine supplementation. So you hear from Dr. Wax a little bit later as well. We're then going to hear about medical rehabilitation, and this is Dr. Stout, Dr. Stout's lab. Kylie Harmon will do an overview. And what they did is they broke down and looked at the literature of creatine in rehabilitation. What type of rehabilitation conditions might creatine benefit? And they had a very nice diagram and broke down what type of conditions will likely benefit from the literature, which ones will possibly be effective, and which ones will be most likely not as effective, so you can determine whether this is something to include in physical rehabilitative recovery. We're then going to have Dr. Abby Smith-Ryan. She did a wonderful paper on the role of creatine in women's health. Dr. Ellery is focusing on infants and newborn. Dr. Smith-Ryan's going to extend that for the lifespan of women. And what you're going to find out is that women typically have less endogenous produced creatine capability. It's about 70 to 80% of male counterparts, which means they are even at a greater need for creatine from the diet. And we're also going to learn that creatine plays a significant role in the menstrual cycle, particularly the creatine kinase system. And so throughout young adolescent female development, through being a mother and through pregnancy, through middle age and adult, and as you get older, premenopausal, postmenopausal, creatine can play an important role in optimizing women's health. We're then going to hear from Dr. Darren Kandow, who's going to summarize the literature about the role of creatine in older adults. And this is something that's kind of developed over the last 10, 15 years, is that if we know that creatine can improve strength, improve muscle mass, if we're middle-aged or older, we add creatine and we do some resistance training in particular, are we stronger, have more muscle mass, have less balance and fall issues? And so he's going to look at whether creatine can enhance strength adaptations, bone density, prevent falls, and therefore be a very important strategy for the overall health and well-being as we age. We're then going to have Dr. Eric Rawson. There's a lot of interest now on the role of creatine in cognitive performance and cognitive brain health. And Dr. Rawson did a paper with one of their colleagues and looked at the role of creatine supplementation in increasing brain creatine content and phosphocreatine content. And when you do that, you seem to improve cognitive function, as well as reduce risk to injuries and things that can be observed from an injury pattern or concussions, et cetera. So he'll spend a whole 30, 40 minutes or so talking about the role of creatine in cognition. We're then going to have Dr. Bruno Galano talk to us about the role of creatine in helping manage blood glucose, particularly in type 2 diabetics who initiate a resistance training program. Creatine is glucose dependent for uptake as well as insulin influences, and we know that if you co-ingest or preload creatine and take carbohydrate, it helps store the carbohydrate better in the muscle. You do that for endurance athletes as a glycogen loading technique. We now know that in some of these populations, there's some accumulating evidence that can help manage the blood glucose response and therefore help a diabetic, type 2 diabetic, during exercise programming, improve their ability to manage blood glucose. So Dr. Galano will give us an update about all that literature. Then there's some fascinating research on the role of creatine on immunity. And Dr. Kristen Dressler from Creighton University is going to talk about how the role of creatine is important for innate and adaptive immune responses. And therefore, it may be an adjunctive therapy to help keep your immune system strong and better able to respond to immune challenges. Fascinating data. We're then going to have Dr. Lily Yang from UCLA talk to us about the role of creatine in T-cell anti-tumor immunity and immunotherapy. Some fascinating research that has been coming out that there are some tumor cells that are deprived and low on creatine content. And therefore, that accelerates the production of creatine or of the tumor growth. But by providing creatine in these animal models, it helps slow down and retard tumor growth. And so there may be some cancers in particular that might be able to be adjunctive therapy to help control the progression of some tumors. Fascinating research. We're then going to have Dr. Balstrino from Italy talk to us about the role of creatine in heart health and in reducing potentially some of the signs and symptoms of heart disease. In fact, creatine plays a role in heart failure, and because heart failure reduces creatine content, by providing more creatine, the heart can function, especially during ischemic conditions when there's not a lot of oxygen. The cells around the ischemic become have a high incidence of death, and by having more phosphocreatine available, it can help those cells withstand the ischemic challenge. Meaning, in animals, if they provoke a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, it can potentially reduce the size of the infarct in those animals. So there's potential for reducing arrhythmias and reducing the severity of heart attacks and other applications that Dr. Balstrino is going to talk to us about. Very fascinating research on the heart. Dr. Holly Clark from Florida State, with Dr. Mike Ormsby and other colleagues there, did a great paper on the role of creatine in vascular health. In fact, creatine plays an important role in the cell smooth muscle compliance. It helps with an antioxidant effect in reducing oxygen species, reactive oxygen species. It not only can affect the mitochondrial response, but improve cell membrane integrity, and all this together can help the vascular smooth beds respond to pressure dynamic changes a little better. And so there's some emerging evidence now that creatine can play a role in vascular health. Dr. Theo Walleman, one of the key individuals on the role of creatine in phosphocreatine pathway and the shuttling pathway in the mitochondria, worked with colleagues, and Dr. Carolyn Hall will present a paper, How Creatine May Play a Role in Modulating or Influencing Response to Inflammatory Bowel Disease. Apparently, the bowel disease is affected by creatine transporter and capacity through the bowel, and that it may help mediate some of the responses to inflammatory bowel disease. And so we hear this new potential thought that this may be a way to be able to do some research in this area to see if this actually pans out. We're then going to have Dr. Stephen Baker. He's going to talk to us about the role of creatine in patients with chronic dialysis or chronic kidney disease who are on dialysis. And usually the dialysis reduces the ability to manage and handle creatine in the diet and can affect homocysteine levels. And therefore, by providing creatine, it may improve the exercise or the capacity of these patients to withstand this dialysis treatment to a greater degree. Then Dr. Ostajic from Serbia is going to talk to us about the role of creatine in post-viral chronic fatigue. A lot of people get chronic fatigue, and some of those symptoms can be mediated or help responded to, improving energy, improving ability to exercise, all those type of things, even cognitive function. They seem to be improved potentially through creatine and even the post-COVID long COVID type of phenomenon. And so this is an emerging area as well that may play a role with creatine supplementation. So we'll hear from Dr. Osterjic about that. Then Dr. Percy Marshall will give us an overview about the role of creatine in mitochondrial dysfunction. And he'll be looking at a number of things and ways that creatine can help the mitochondria respond, particularly during stressful conditions or ischemic conditions, and therefore enhance the body's ability to withstand insults that may be related to that. Then we'll have Dr. Yeager do an overview. We know there's creatine monohydrate out there, but there's also other types of creatine. And the question is, are they bioavailable? Do they work? And we just published a very extensive overview about the role of creatine on bioavailability, which ones seem to go in the blood, which ones seem to go in the tissue, which ones increase tissue concentrations to a greater degree. And the result, therefore, is which ones seem to be affected. And if you look at the right, creatine monohydrate still the one that seems to be most of the studies, 98% of the studies have been done on, and consistently shows some effects. Some of the others have some data showing some evidence suggesting they may work to some degree, although typically not as much as creatine monohydrate. And then there's a whole list of things that either have never been studied, or if they have been studied, do not show any evidence at this point of efficacy. So Dr. Yeager will give us an update of the role of creatine, different types of creatine out there in the market. Finally, we're going to finish up with some original research. As we invited scholars to contribute to this special issue, a number said, hey, we also got some data, would you consider that? And so we're going to include some of these papers as an idea of the type of work that's being done with creatine. And so Diego Bonilla is going to talk to us about functional genomics as a way to assess potential areas of additional research that can be done from a genomic standpoint with creatine supplementation. Dr. Osterjic is going to report on some of the dietary creatine data they have, showing better maturation and growth in kids that have higher creatine content in their diet. Scott Forbes, who's done a lot with creatine, particularly with older individuals. He did a meta-analysis on the role of creatine in improving muscle mass and strength in older adults. We also have Chantel Ryan out of Brock University. He's going to talk about the role of creatine and maybe a fat metabolic enhancer. Interesting. Then Salvador Vargas Molina is going to do a talk about how using creatine with cluster set training can enhance potential training adaptations. And then finally, we're going to have an update from Brian Sanders, who's going to talk to us about the role of creatine timing. Does it really make a difference? So that gives you an overview of what the conference is going to be. We now have extended this special issue to a second year. And so we're going to have a call for more papers to submit to try to build the momentum in this area to do more creatine research. And one of those papers will be an overview of the safety and common myths. We wanted this in our book, but unfortunately, we published a paper in the ISSN journal in January and beat it to the punch. But we're going to have Dr. Joey Antonio, Trish Drop, and Scott Forbes talk to us about some myths related to creatine supplementation we've all heard about, which does it cause water retention, is it steroid, all these type of things you hear about, even things like baldness. And we're going to find if there's any truth to that. And then we also have invited Dr. Kios and Renshaw to do a paper on our next issue on the antidepressive effects of creatine. So they've agreed to do a paper. We're looking forward to seeing that published. And the data on that shows that if you have low creatine content in your diet, you have more depression. And that if they take patients who are on antidepressant medications and they give some of those patients creatine, it seems to enhance the ability of those medications to work such that there's less desire for things like suicide. So they're going to do an update about a paper they published a few years ago, and that will be in our next issue. So this conference is going to go into all the medical aspects of creatine supplementation. Not only talk about the traditional effects on exercise and energy systems and performance, but really the goal here is to get us all to think of how creatine may be enhanced by adding it to the diet through either supplementation or increasing in food content, especially in populations that may benefit from creatine supplementation. And our hope from all this research and all this discussion is that we'll now set the stage for the next 5 to 10 years of research to really expand to see how creatine can play a role in general health throughout the lifespan. So with that, thank you very much, and we look forward to having a great conference.